Good evening and welcome to tonight's event of the Festival of Debates. My name is Johnny and I'll be your host for tonight's live stream. On the call we have our panelists and my colleague Sam, who will be supporting the event and answering your queries and posting useful links in the chat function on tonight's webinar. Tonight's event is part of the 2021 Festival of Debate, an annual programme coordinated by the For Impact social enterprise Opus Independence, which brings together people to share new ideas that can help shape our understanding of the world. This year's programme is Pay As You Feel to ensure that all online events are free at the point of access, but we do rely on donations from audience members to help us make this happen. So if you are in a position and can donate, please do so at festivaldebate.com or in the links provided in the chat. The festival team will be monitoring the chat this evening. We'd like to ask all audience members to be respectful to others and will remove anyone from our event that does not follow our SAPER festival policy, which is available on the website. If you'd like to ask any questions tonight, please use the Q&A function, which is actually different to the chat function. Chat function allows you to chat to other audience members. The Q&A function is there for you to submit questions to our panelists, which we'll try and get to in the last half of tonight's event. We should have about 45 minutes of tonight's live stream to take questions. In that chat Q&A function, you'll also notice that there's a thumbs up to like questions. So even if you haven't thought of a question yourself, please do upvote other participants and attendees' questions so that we've got a democratic way of picking which questions we put to our panel first. We will, of course, as I say, broadcast on multiple platform channels this evening on YouTube, Facebook and Twitter, and you can tweet us at Fest of Debate, links in the chat and for sharing. But without further ado, I will hand over to your host for this evening, Keith.
Thank you, Johnny. I hope that's working okay. Great introduction. Welcome to the Empire Strikes Back and to this evening's discussion. We need to remind ourselves how important imperialism is. Imperialism shapes and scars the world. As Johnny's just said, we've got three speakers. Dave Berry from Independent Working Class Education Network, John Smith, a researcher and the author of Imperialism in the 21st Century, and Leah Sullivan from War on Want. I'm going to not spend much time on introductions, so basically the first speaker is going to be Dave Berry, and the second will be John Smith, and the third will be Leah. Now, Dave has a background as a worker in the gas industry. He became convener in the union that he was in then and is still in, which is the GMB. And Dave is an activist within Independent Working Class Education. Dave, over to you, my friend.
So welcome to everyone to this event and thank you for coming along. It is essentially a follow-on from a number of events we've held over various times, but it's good to welcome you with two other speakers to talk about something that we don't talk about enough. I have Johnny managing my slides, so if he would like to put the first slide up. If I can just start by welcoming John and Leah to the event. I can thoroughly recommend John's book as a great read, even for those who aren't formal economists. He's managed, like many of us who come to education later in life, to be able to take something that academics like to make complicated and actually put it into layman's language that actually makes sense and shows up many of the idiosyncrasies and fallacies that modern economics likes to put across. And also to Leah from War on Want. War on Want I've followed from the 1970s. They've also been at the forefront of fighting campaigns for trade unions, for indigenous people. So it's good to be alongside them. They're going to talk about more contemporary issues within 21st century imperialism. But I'm going to try and put it in context. Many people feel that if you talk to them, particularly the right-wing press, tell you that there's no such thing as imperialism. It ended many years ago. So I'm going to try and put it into some sort of historical context as background to John and Leah. So next slide, Johnny. I think it's always debatable about when capitalism began. Empire has been with us throughout its history, but certainly capitalist imperialism probably started around 1700, and in its formal sort of sense that we recognize, it talks about occupation of territory and control of populations, their resources, their economies, and their legal system. But something we don't really understand from history, that very often it was the private sector that was at the forefront of empire building. Those who watched the drama last year, Taboo, about the East India Company, will have seen how that worked. Another really one is the Belgian Congo, with the history of the Belgians in the Congo and the extension of that empire was actually by a private company that was formed by the Belgian monarch and the Belgian nation. It wasn't all about force either. They were often allied with the ruling groups of the colonial nations. It was often kept in force through divide and rule. And as recently as 5 or 6 years ago, I heard a British general on the radio saying that we shouldn't have forces in Afghanistan. We should be going back to the old empire ways of dividing and ruling and gaining control through people fighting one another. All regimes can never be kept in by force. In labour process theory, Braverman always talks about manipulation being key and force being held in reserve. And even at home, people have to be persuaded, support things. And very often for the nationalistic imperial powers, it was by the moral persuasion of good deeds, of religious missionaries bringing savages to God and the civilizing effect of Europeanism or whatever. And it all has to be seen within the context of what was going on in those imperial nations. Other wars were happening within those nations, which were mainly class wars. In 1833, we celebrate the passing of the act that abolished slavery in the British Empire. But at the same year, in the same parliament, the first Factory Act was passed under pressure from Labour, organised labour, banning children under the age of 9 for working more than 12 hours a day. So other battles were going on, and the imperial conquests were used to try and satiate some of that demand. This carried on for almost 250 years and culminated in the inevitable financial crisis and 2 world wars. Next slide, Johnny. After the Second World War, the devastating effects of first the wars, but also the financial crises, a number of new institutions were set up between the 1945 peace conferences, and they were aimed really at stopping imperial capitalist competition. But more importantly, they were also to try and bring political peace after 2 devastating wars. They were also faced with the ideological challenge from the socialist bloc, from first the revolution in Russia and then the beginning of the Cold War in 1945. Also, the Second World War and before had provoked national independence movements. We had Kenyatta in Africa, Gandhi in India, in Burma. Many other countries, nations were wanting their own independence and were tired of the old empire rule. The war had also brought more to the fore the idea of state involvement in industry and planning. And we saw particularly in the 1945 Labour government, the welfare state, but also the nationalisation of industries and local government taking part in house building and things like that. There were also new economies that were growing, normally with government assistance, the Southeast Asian economies, the Japanese economy, Hong Kong, South Korea. And even the empire nations were distrustful of the private sector and brought in antitrust legislation or anti-monopoly. And that was seen as a successful period. Thomas Piketty, in his book Capital, calls these, the French call them les 30 glorieuses, the 30 glorious years. And the Italians refer to them as the economico miracolo. So it was a relatively successful and 30 years of my life, really. Next slide, please, Johnny. Like I say, the institutions that were set up were really about providing political stability, but also looking after the competition between the world's leading nations. You know, the World Bank was set up to provide development loans and advice to developing countries. The International Monetary Fund was meant to provide currency stability and to provide emergency loans in case there were trouble with exchange rates. But the thing that really drives modern imperialism was the beginning of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which was set up really to manage the trade between the large nations, originally 23 countries, and it was about eliminating tariffs, setting up quotas, and really managing trade. And the developing nations were recognized as having a special status, and they began to adopt economic policies of import substitution, industrialization, behind the protection of borders and tariffs. Next slide, Johnny. The mid-1970s and IWC are now trying to put together events. You know, the 1970s are very often seen as a grey period, but for those of us of a certain age, they were good times. And certainly for many of us, they were the times where we received our political education, but also had jobs that paid well, we could afford to live, and we went to university, or some of us went to university free. But the crisis of the mid-70s was taken advantage by the return of the old liberals in the new guise of neoliberals. And it was an old ideology in new wrapping, really. It was based on free trade that we'd seen had led to the start of the First World War, and then the crises that led to the Second. And it was based on the theories of David Ricardo, an economist from the 1780s, and his idea of comparative advantage about free markets and competition between nations. The champions of this movement were people like Hayek and Friedman, and their approach to life was not to want to be a mass movement, but to capture academia, industry, and finance through its institutions and its leading people. Friedman said, I don't want it to be an economic philosophy of one party, but all parties. And his chief idea was the free movement of capital, to free up the capitalists once again from the chains that have been placed around them post-Second World War. It saw the growth of think tanks like the Chicago School, the Institute of Economic Affairs, and the Mont Pelerin Society. Probably another one to mention here is something called the Trilateral Commission, which was set up by the Rockefeller Institute in the 1970s, made up of businessmen, politicians from Europe, America, and Japan. And they came back with at least one major piece of work called The Crisis of Democracy, which actually said there was too much democracy.
You're about two-thirds of the way through, Dave.
Okay. Like I say, it began a revolving door between government, business, and academia. And George Monbiot, who is a bit Marmite to some people, wrote a very good article called The Ideology at the Root of All Our Problems. Next slide, please. These were the rules of what was called the Washington Consensus, and we'll begin to recognize some of them. The fiscal discipline, which became known as austerity for many of us. The redirecting of public expenditure to support the private sector. Tax reform, which wasn't about increasing taxes. The liberalization of finance, which we see today through derivatives and the 2009 crisis. Adoption of a single competitive exchange rate. What we're talking about tonight is really trade liberalization, the elimination of the barriers to capital, privatization of state-owned enterprises, and as an ex-gas man, I'm well aware of the consequences of that. The deregulation of market entry and competition, and we see that in some of the scandals we have really about Enron and things like that. And the main one really, which particularly the US has pushed on around the world, is the security of private property. Next slide, please. Let's say this was all aided by the crisis of the 70s and particularly the fall of the Soviet Union and any competing ideology. The Washington Consensus spread around the world. GATS failed really because they tried to impose deregulation on the developing countries. And the WTO was formed in 1994. And because they couldn't get agreement with the developing nations, they encouraged setting up of bilateral and regional trade deals to further the aims of the Washington Consensus. These were things like the EU, NAFTA, TTIP, TPP, and lots of things we now see coming down the track, like CETA and the US trade deal. Next slide, please. It does have its disciples, traditional liberals like Paul Krugman, and because border restrictions hurt consumers more than they help producers or generate revenue, unilateral disarmament of barriers to trade ought to occur spontaneously without the need for an international organisation or self-negotiations as countries follow their own self-interest. And it's this belief as economics as a self-managing equilibrium that has failed, but people still find excuses for it.
2 minutes, Dave.
Next slide. These are some of the weapons of imperialism that come within WTO rules and many of the trade agreements. TRIMS, which is the Agreement on Trade-Related Investment Measures, which allows the free movement of capital and prevents governments from interfering. Agreement on Trade-Related Intellectual Property Rights is something that the third world and the developing countries know that they can't copy Western technology and have fines imposed on them if they do. Foreign direct investment is a free movement of capital. We see the old anti-monopoly laws failing and oligopoly. Large organizations like Google, Alibaba, Amazon beginning to control global markets. We've talked about the regional trade agreements. Global value chains, which is really about the movement of labour around the world. All this is backed up by what are called investor state development courts, where governments can be taken to courts by private companies. Recently, we have the Belgian government being taken to court by RWE, the German energy company, suing them because Belgium is doing away with its coal-fired power stations. And also in Australia, their government has been taken to court because of controls on marketing of cigarettes. End of capital controls, financialisation, and where all this fails, we've seen the beginning of the return to military might and the use of economic sanctions against countries. And finally, a lot of the discussion tonight will be about labour, and for many of us, it's the most human commodity of all, really, because it is the source of all value. And John's book goes into that in great detail, really. And this has been a battle throughout history. And in 1914, the Clayton Act specified that labour is not an economic commodity and shouldn't be sold and bought as any goods or services. This was backed up by the Declaration of Philadelphia in 1944. And it talked about the centrality of human rights, social policy, and the need for economic planning. And recently, in 2008, the ILO Declaration on Social Justice reinforced that. But of course, under the current imperialist regime of the Washington Consensus, the ILO has been sidelined, and we never talk very much about labour rights when we talk about trade. And of course, as with the old moral persuasion on the old national imperialism, we have it now with the new imperialism, where the idea of free trade is seen as very good and the movement of capital, everything is free, but it always comes at the cost, normally to labour. Here's a few more things you might want to read to help you along. And really, that's a swift jog through 300 years of economic history. So I'll hand you over to more contemporary stuff now from John and Leah.
Okay, thank you, Dave. I mean, I found that personally, the contextualization particularly helpful. And I shall have to learn a bit more about the Washington Consensus, which seemed to be such an important pivot of what you're talking about. Thank you for that, Dave. Moving on now to John Smith. John Smith describes himself as an independent researcher and an activist living in Sheffield. He's the author of Imperialism in the 21st Century. And I now hand it over to John. Thank you, my friend.
Hello there. Hello, everybody. I'm going to now share my screen. And there we are. Okay, this is the, as we all know, I'm sure, the week of the first anniversary since the brutal murder of George Floyd in the USA. And this was surely one of the most significant events in recent times. What gave it such significance? Well, there were various factors. Two amongst others explain the huge impact of this particular crime. First, it was so similar to so many others committed by forces of the state against poor people and especially people of colour in the United States and around the world. Secondly, because it was filmed in its entirety by a young teenager called Darnella Frazier. And the murderer knew that he was being filmed, and yet he felt able to continue with his crime because he felt he was acting with impunity. Anyway, it is appropriate to begin my talk with this event because the killing of George Floyd has sparked a huge and extremely significant debate on the legacy of colonialism and imperialism. Yet one element in this debate is largely missing, at least from the edited version of the debate that finds its way into the media. And that is acknowledgement of the fact that colonialism and imperialism are not just legacy questions. They are not just phenomena from the 18th, 19th, and maybe 20th century, but it is still very much, in fact, a 21st century phenomenon. The age of imperialism is very much still with us, and that's what I want to establish in the 14.5 minutes I've got left. I would argue that this is the prime reason, in fact, why defenders of the status quo are so hostile to discussion of the past, because they are afraid that we might draw the connection between the past and the present and actually see how the present is evolved from the past and has an enormous degree of continuity with it. This is, let me advance my screen here. There is the famous picture of Colston statue being toppled. So there are three reasons why imperialism is yes, I don't like cliches, but I'm certainly going to use this one, the elephant in the room. So I don't know, I hope you heard the little sound clip of an elephant trumpeting associated with that file. So the three reasons I'm going to give why acknowledging this reality is essential, why any political philosophy or economic program which is not founded on the foundation of acknowledgement of the imperialist character of the global economy and of global society is invalid and useless. I think just to preface my remarks, I'd like to say that we must call things by their true names. When we talk of systemic racism, the system we are talking about is capitalism, a generic term based on the private ownership of means of production and the exploitation of wage labor. To maintain their supremacy, the owners of social wealth sow racial and gender divisions to turn us against each other. That is a precondition for their maintenance in power. And to maximize their profits, they pit us into competition with each other. That is why the systemic racism, when we use the word system, the system we are talking about is the capitalist system. And we cannot hope to overcome racism so long as capitalism continues. So the term imperialism, in the usage that I give to it, it's a specific term for the contemporary stage of capitalism. The amount of wealth being accumulated in the so-called advanced countries is so great. The only way that they continue to make a profit on the total amount of that wealth is by extending their exploitation to the rest of the world. The impulse of capitalists in the so-called advanced or developed countries to move in an imperialist direction is built into the is intrinsic, built into their system. I want to give you an example of why we must confront this reality. This is the cost breakdown of a £2.50 cup of coffee. This data comes from a study that was published in the Financial Times a year or two back. What's so startling about it is that it shows that a £2.50 cup of coffee, just 1p, actually goes to the farmer who actually grew that coffee. Another 1 pence will stay in the coffee producing country and will be shared between the processor, the transporter, and the trader. The other £2.48 will appear in the gross domestic product of the country where this coffee is consumed. So just 2p will be added to the GDP of Kenya or Colombia or Brazil or Indonesia or wherever the coffee comes from. The other £2.48 will appear in the gross domestic product of the country where this coffee is consumed. The 1p which the coffee farmer actually receives is not enough to pay for the education of her or his children. In fact, the labor of her or his children is required when it comes to harvest time. They cannot afford to hire labor. So the 1p which the coffee farmer gets is far less. It's been calculated by the same article, in fact, is less than the actual costs of production. And that is why so many coffee farmers, in fact, the vast majority of coffee farmers live in extreme poverty. I've worked out that if you work out the proportion of the total crop of coffee that's consumed in Britain, there are 25 million coffee farmers in the world, plus their families. It works out that there is an army of around 700,000 coffee farmers who spend their entire lives solely servicing the coffee drinking appetite of consumers in this country. So the picture we see for coffee can be reproduced for countless other commodities which are consumer goods in rich countries, and also the intermediate goods that are used to assemble final products. Another example that's we find exactly the same basic picture if we look at a hypothetical jacket. This shows the cost breakdown of a jacket sold for $120 in the United States. And again, we see that the amount that actually goes to the worker that produced that item is infinitesimally small, and is not enough to satisfy the basic needs of those workers, because the vast majority of clothing is now produced in low-wage countries like Bangladesh, Vietnam, Myanmar, China, etc. Those of you who are old enough to remember, at one time Marks and Spencer used to have as part of their brand image that every single item of clothing was actually made in the UK. You cannot find an item of clothing in Marks and Spencer's these days that was not made in some low-wage country. So this is one of the reasons why the imperialist character of the global economy, the quantity of wealth that is being produced by highly exploited working people in poor countries, why that is invisible, because that £2.48 of each cup of coffee that appears in the gross domestic product of this country or the £19 of a £20 shirt you buy in Marks and Spencer's, all of this appears to result from activities within Britain. You cannot trace a single penny of these profits back to the country where these goods were produced. In fact, just going back to the cup of coffee, it can be estimated that of the £2.50 that you pay for your cup of coffee, around £1 of it will end up in the hands of the British government through VAT, through taxes on the wages and profits of all of the people in this country who are involved in the production of the coffee. Of that £1, which the British government will end up with in the form of taxes, around 25 to 30 pence of it will be used to pay for the cost of the health service.
You're halfway through,
okay.
John.
So the health service actually will consume, each cup of coffee that you pay for in a coffee shop, up to 30p of it will go to help pay the NHS. So when you hear people saying, why should we let our NHS be available to asylum seekers and migrants, the answer should be because they have helped to pay for it. That is the true answer, but nobody is saying this. Anyway, the arguments that I've studied that I develop in my book, and I think I prove the argument, is that the only way in which the rich advanced countries were able to escape from the crisis of the 1970s was by shifting production to low-wage countries. They could not come to workers here in Sheffield or in the United States or whatever to say that we need to cut your wages by 30, 40, 50% because there'd have been an uprising. However, they were able to achieve cost cuts and thereby boost their profits by shifting production on a vast scale to poor countries. And here you can see how in the neoliberal era, the distribution of industrial workers in the world moved from more or less parity at the beginning of the neoliberal era, 1980, to the situation we have today where 5 out of 6 industrial workers are in low-wage countries. So that's my first exhibit. The first reason why I think we have to talk about imperialism, because the profits and prosperity and social peace in the rich countries is ever more dependent on super exploited workers in poor countries. Here are a few of them just before we move on. These are Bangladeshi women working in clothing factories where the average working day is 12 hours, the average working week is 6 days, and still they cannot afford to feed their kids. We are intimately related and connected to them because they make our clothes, even our underclothes. These are scenes, both of those two scenes are taken from demonstrations that took place in Dhaka, Bangladesh in the immediate aftermath of the collapse of the Rana Plaza building. And the same picture can be the same picture I'm giving of the cup of coffee and the item of clothing can be seen if we look at, in this case, the smartphone in our hands. The huge number of them are assembled by workers working in Foxconn in Shenzhen in China. Okay, second reason is the COVID catastrophe, and I'll try and have to rattle through this very quickly. Dr. Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus said that the unequal international distribution of COVID-19 vaccines is a catastrophic moral failure. The world's poorest countries wonder whether rich countries really mean what they say when they talk about solidarity. I think we've heard about this. It's amazing how the politicians completely ignore what the World Health Organization's Director General is saying. And here we have, very recently, he said that the lowest income countries have received just 0.3% of the vaccine doses that have so far been created. And he refers to the HIV epidemic, and we should remember this, that it took more than 10 years for the pharmaceutical corporations to make antiretrovirals available to people in Africa. at least 10 million and up to 17 million Africans died before drugs which existed and were available were actually made available to people in Africa. And we are seeing history repeating itself. This is imperialism. Some people call this vaccine apartheid. Winnie Byanyima is a leading campaigner for a people's vaccine. Not only is it the case that the rich countries have commandeered the vast bulk of supply of vaccine, but also it is pharmaceutical corporations based in the imperialist countries that are producing the vast majority of the vaccines, and that they are intending to make huge super profits out of this.
2 minutes, Dave.
Okay. Here is an image that shows you the 20 most valuable, that's as quoted on stock markets, pharmaceutical corporations in the world. So I'll have to rattle through these slides here. 4 companies, these 4 were responsible for or captured 90% of total vaccine revenues in 2019. Just for those who think that there is some kind of narrowing going on in living standards in rich and poor countries, these data here are extremely eloquent. The difference in the per capita health spending between rich and poor countries is absolutely staggering. And the frontline health workers in poor countries are not able to get access to the vaccines which exist right now because of the greed and selfishness of rich countries. So what few health workers they have are being decimated by the coronavirus pandemic. This is an outrage, a catastrophic moral failure. This is modern imperialism, what I call vaccine imperialism. Okay, I'm just going to finish off on this point, and that is the other aspect of the coronavirus scandal catastrophe is the way that rich countries are spending huge amounts to mitigate the effects of the coronavirus pandemic on their own populations. But what they are doing to help poor countries is infinitesimal by comparison. Total pledges by G7 countries to finance COVAX distribution come to not much more than 1/2000th of what they're spending on fiscal stimulus in their own countries. The UK's share, £500 million, is just over 10% of what they've cut from their aid budget. And the last point I'll probably have to finish here, I guess, and that is that the only generosity which rich countries have shown to the poor countries is to agree that the poorest countries will be allowed to postpone their debt payments until the end of 2021. And that in Latin America, for instance, some of the worst affected countries like Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, Mexico, Brazil, none of these are eligible even for a postponement. And all of that money has to be paid eventually. And not only that, it is only available to loans to public bodies. Private lenders were asked and requested and urged to follow the supposed generosity of the G7 governments and also offer a postponement of their debts, but they have completely refused. So the only effect of the G7 generosity is to enable poor countries to continue servicing their debts to the loan sharks, to the private creditors. In other words, the only people who are being bailed out are the private investors in those countries. This is all facets of the actual imperialist character of the global economy, which has been shown and thrown into extremely sharp focus by the coronavirus pandemic. And the third example I was going to give is the capitalist destruction of nature, which is, in my view, what we should call climate change. And all I'll say here is there's a slide that shows the global north is responsible for 92% of total excess carbon dioxide emissions. There's also data which shows that the richest 10% of the population are responsible for the great majority of the increase in carbon dioxide emissions. And the final thing I'll finish on this promise, we're going to hear a lot when the G7 meets in down in Devon or wherever it is, about the COP meeting up in Glasgow. We should just recall that in 2015, when the Paris Climate Accord was reached, one of the main elements in the Paris Climate Agreement was that rich countries agreed that they would pay $100 billion per year to help poor countries to mitigate the effects of climate change caused by rich country emissions, and also help them to adapt to a low carbon economy.
And finally, John,
they have failed completely to fulfill these pledges. The most recent data show that their pledges have amounted to no more than 18 billion out of the promised 100 billion.
Okay, John.
So all the promises of the past, they have failed. And I'd say climate change is my third reason for why we must acknowledge the imperialist character of the global world economy and the global society that we are living in. Thank you.
Thank you, John, and for introducing us to the stench of modern capitalism. Thank you very much, John. I know no one can see anybody except I can, but I do think for Dave and for John, you know, sometimes on these Zooms you actually applaud. No one can see you, but I mean, let's still do that, shall we, if you want to. Can I just also ask people before I introduce Leah to begin to take advantage of the Q&A section? We've got, I think, just one question so far, but please do put more questions onto the Q&A. Okay, thank you very much. Leah works for War on Want, and just to quote a bit from some information I was sent, War on Want's main crime, according to the Daily Mail, was exposing colonialism and encouraging liberation movements. The paper devoted a front-page lead story in 1987, accusing War of Want of a blatant propaganda barrage against America, the West, NATO, and imperialism generally. Leah is a trade campaigner for War on Want. War on Want campaigns in the UK to challenge human rights abuses of those by corporation governments, to hold those responsible for inequality and poverty to account. Leah, over to you.
Thanks very much, Keith. Good evening, everyone. It's really good to be here. So War on Want, we believe that poverty is political. It's the result of decisions made by those who hold power and a broken economic system which generates increasing wealth for elites at the expense of the global majority. I'll just say now that I don't have a PowerPoint presentation, so it's just going to be me. Hope that's okay. Our work on trade is central to this belief that poverty is political, and we have a history of campaigns against comprehensive trade agreements like TTIP and CETA. It's really good to be here and part of this interesting and important discussion, so thank you very much for the invitation. I think it's important because in the UK we get an onslaught of propaganda about the pursuit of so-called free and freer trade as an inherent good and as an end in itself, which fundamentally is meaning fewer and fewer rules to constrain the power and mobility of capital. And because the voices critiquing trade and willing to critique trade, not only features of free trade deals and the impacts they have on things like food and farming standards on people in the UK, but to critique free trade deals from an internationalist perspective and with the interests of the global working class at its center are really quite few. So in thinking about whether and how trade is the new imperialism, based on what I've said, it perhaps won't surprise you that I am in broad agreement with the thrust of the proposals and arguments that we've heard already. And I'll thank John for sort of looking into the ways in which free trade agreements have entrenched the sort of commodity export dependency that reflects sort of colonial relationships between countries of the global north and south. And we see that in the continuation of the UK trade policy. With an independent trade policy, there was an opportunity to rethink those kind of relationships. But what we see is increasing sort of tariff escalation, a continuation of a trend whereby developing countries were encouraged to sort of specialize in the export of raw materials, which is highly correlated with debt, as markets are catering to the north and dependent on price fluctuations of those commodities. So in thinking about, I guess we traditionally think about imperial powers in terms of countries, but one sort of addition to this or development of this is that so I guess we traditionally see, or imperialism gives an impression of a relationship of one country dominating another, with benefits accruing to the dominating country and its people. And it sort of I guess a nuance to this is that with new mega-regional free trade agreements and the most recent wave of free trade liberalization, which has increased inequality both within and between countries, including those in the north, the spoils of trade liberalization accrue less and less even to working people in developed countries, but do accrue to a small number of multinational corporations and investment funds. Thus, my sort of temporary hypothesis is that free trade agreements, multinational banks and investment funds multinational banks and investment funds use free trade agreements to shift capital around to weaken the labor movement everywhere, enabling capital to exploit not only in the periphery, but also to exploit labor within the core. So I want to offer, in the time I have left, a look at how the free trade agenda continues to reshape our economy, to look to digital trade and ISDS as ways that UK trade policy is reproducing exploitative dynamics created between economically unequal trading partners and undermining any chance of addressing the global crises of climate and inequality, before suggesting some things we can do to change the direction of travel. So free trade has been described as an ideological model that tries to disembed capital from its social and environmental context. So I want to look quickly at the ways in which we've seen this happen, seen this change. Earlier waves of trade liberalization in the 80s and 90s focused on tariff liberalization, so the removal of tariffs, and it resulted in massive scale job losses and premature deindustrialization in countries that applied the policy prescriptions of the Washington Consensus. So if you're debating this with someone, you might hear people point out countries where they say that trade has had a positive impact, but by and large, they didn't apply the Washington Consensus principles. In the last 20 years, we have seen more and more preferential trade agreements, more comprehensive economic deals, which rewrite rules of national policy making above and beyond this sort of tariff liberalization. We've seen an intensification of pressure on countries to remove so-called non-tariff barriers to trade. So this is beyond tariffs, the reduction or removal of regulations on investment, banking, finance, health, safety, and environmental standards, workers' rights, among others that are seen to, quote unquote, distort trade. Where these developments have been rejected, rightly rejected by Southern countries in the World Trade Organization, these and other issues of interest to developed countries became increasingly addressed in bilateral and regional trade agreements. Alongside the WTO, groups of mostly developed countries take forward these issues in so-called plurilateral discussions. And this has happened hand in hand with a process by which the negotiations of other policy areas like intellectual property became subsumed into the sphere of the WTO, because basically trade rules are binding, whereas often other policy areas are not enforceable in the same way, which is why capital sees an interest in bringing these policy areas into the binding sphere of the WTO. Some will point out we haven't seen sort of pure trade liberalization over the last 5 years, noting that there's been trade restrictions between the US and China. However, some suggest these are less a rejection of free trade rather than a reflection of inequality within states. Countries that have experienced surpluses in trade, like China, Germany, and Japan, haven't necessarily seen an improvement in the living conditions of working people in those countries, or an improvement in levels of inequality in those countries. Rather, the profits and benefits of trade surpluses are being geared towards the interests of capital. So if we can speak of phases of the free trade liberalization agenda, with one wave of expansion in the 80s and 90s focused on tariff liberalization, and then another of the contemporary era through mega regional deals that seek deregulation and privatization, what has this meant for working people everywhere? Well, we see a global decline in the labor share of income, seen that continue. In addition to increasing within country inequality, we see a growing inequality between countries since 1980, if China is excluded. In developed countries, the vast majority of people experience a stagnation or fall in living standards. Inequality has increased, with figures showing in 2019 the UK to have the highest levels of income inequality in the EU. And in the UK, wages have barely risen, with a big increase in the number of working people in poverty. We've seen an increase in the concentration also of wealth in the hands of corporations, and digitalization of all aspects of human life, a huge increase in the influence of data gathering, use of algorithms, and on-demand labor platforms in the world of work. One of the reasons I mention that is because one of the areas that I wanted to pick out as a feature of the more recent wave of trade liberalization, to assess it from the perspective of seeing trade as a new form of imperialism, is digital trade, and the other is ISDS, which has already been mentioned. So I wanted to focus on digital trade because it's an issue which not only impacts working conditions and unemployment in developed economies. If we think about what we've seen in the news recently around Amazon workers having to pee in bottles and being monitored intensively in their places of work. There's also a concern that the digital trade agenda and the way the UK is pushing it will compound inequality and power imbalances across the globe that were created by the earlier wave of trade liberalization. So key to understanding sort of the digital trade agenda is thinking about the role that data plays in our economy. Our increasingly digitalized lives create ever and ever more data points that reveal trends about the way we live, eat, travel, consume, love, relate to each other, and all of it is of enormous value. Data has been called the world's most valuable resource, and for that reason, it's critical for all countries to be able to use that data generated by their citizens for their economic development and to build public goods and services. But we've seen an increase in the digital provisions in trade deals, reflecting this kind of growing power of big tech over many aspects of our lives. And in the view of Deborah James, who is an expert in this area, this reflects the desire of big tech lobbyists to have a trade agreement at the WTO that essentially locks in their interest, in the same way that the other big industry lobbies have had their own kind of agreement at the WTO. So big agriculture has got the agreement on agriculture. Big pharma has TRIPS. That's the thing we're now looking to get a waiver from in order to be able to ramp up the COVID vaccine. So big tech wants their own agreement. So what would such an agreement do? Well, the agreement, much like digital provisions in trade deals, are basically sort of like a shopping list for big tech companies. They want to lock in rules that make it impossible for countries to regulate them. And they see trade deals as the easiest way of making this happen. Basically, these kind of rules would ban countries from being able to regulate data flows, being able to require transnational organizations to have a local presence in a country, would ban them from being able to require a set of data to be stored locally, would ban them from being able to use local technology or local servers, would ban them from being able to tax big tech companies. And as you probably already know, with all of the things you see in the news about Uber and delivery drivers, the labor rights impacts of these digital trade provisions are already skewing power, or rather of these what big tech wants, essentially this kind of absence of regulation skews power in favor of the employer, resulting in the intensification of work, increased surveillance of workers, the inability of labor to enforce labor standards if the company doesn't have to establish a local presence. They can lock in social inequalities around in hiring through the use of algorithms that sort of bake in existing gender and racial inequalities. It particularly will affect workers in less secure, less well-paid sectors, and it's been noted that the majority of new jobs created or multiplied by tech are precarious and so-called low-skilled. The objective then is an infinite supply of cheap labor in which corporations control all of the data. And so while many of the current examples look at the gig economy workers in developed countries, workers in the South are also likely to be some of the biggest losers from current models of data extractivism, because their work produces insights that may ultimately put them out of work through automation. And the mechanisms by which developing countries might hope to develop through industrialization are banned under digital trade or other trade provisions. So when we look back to the premature deindustrialization of the 80s and 90s, there's a danger of repeating those same mistakes.
2 minutes, Leah.
Oh dear. Okay, I'm not nearly finished. So perhaps I'll just try and wrap it up by saying, UK trade policy is, if you notice the kind of things they're saying, the G7 in the news, they take every opportunity to talk up digital trade. They've joined this plurilateral at the WTO. They are funding developing countries to be a part of this, despite the fact that having a multilateral agreement on digital trade would be terrible for countries and for those countries and for workers. I just want to very briefly highlight ISDS as well. ISDS, as has already been mentioned, is a provision whereby corporations can sue governments in special courts. It's the provision written into trade agreements if those countries do things that affect the profit or potential future profit of those companies. They give corporations absolutely huge power to extract public money from countries, and they increasingly do this towards countries of the global south. So how this reproduces imperialism essentially is that the vast majority of investors who take cases against countries are based in the global north. The UK has been the home state for investors for over 90 cases, and it has only had to respond to one case. Year after year, most new cases are brought against developing countries. In the last couple of years, there's been a huge increase in cases against African countries, with Libya, Zimbabwe, Burundi particularly badly damaged by the results of ISDS lawsuits. Particularly egregious cases include the Piero Foresti case, in which Luxembourgish and Italian investors took a case against the state of South Africa over the Black economic empowerment law, so anti-apartheid legislation. They said this was expropriation. This impacted their profits. They wanted that overturned. There was a case against Pakistan where an Australian investor got $6 billion out of the country over a mine that it didn't even build. Just it had an expectation that it would build it and would get this profit. So it said it wanted that money back from the country who had just received that same amount of money in an IMF bailout loan. So it completely nullified it. It's also increasingly used by fossil fuel companies. So the use of ISDS by fossil fuel companies sort of not only means that ISDS not only directly expropriates public finances of developing countries, but also fuels the climate crisis, which disproportionately affects those least responsible for it. So to conclude, developed country trade priorities, like those of the UK, are moving into areas that define power relations between working people and capital in the 21st century, like the regulation of the digital economy. The UK's new profile as an independent trading nation sees it rehearse a familiar role, kind of reprising the role of the EU's economic partnership agreements, which undermine prospects for structural economic transformation. And what we can do, well, we need a huge overhaul fundamentally, But I think there's certain things that we can win because we know that people power taking action against trade deals can be successful. So in terms of what's realistic, what's feasible, we can get ISDS out of UK trade deals. At least that's our ambition at War on Want. And also thanks to John for mentioning the TRIPS waiver. That's also something that we have campaigns on. That's also an incredibly important thing that we can do. But yeah, I'll finish up there because I know I'm probably over time. But yeah, if anyone has further questions, I am happy to add. We also have an action that's going to be going out and next week, I will put some links in the chat for those who might want to sign up for updates and possibly take it. Thanks.
Again, thank you very much, Leah, for an interesting presentation. And no one can see me, but well, people don't see each other, but we're clapping in response to your contribution. Thank you very much indeed. I noticed that now more and more people are using the Q&A. I believe that you can actually vote which questions you'd like to be put at the top of the list, but I'm going to start, if that's okay, with the one at the top of the list just now, which is for John and from Dave and Karen Buckley. And it asks the question, what role do the rich and powerful in the poor countries have within the imperialist structure, which is so clearly explained? That's the question from Dave and Karen to John, and perhaps others would want to answer that as well. John?
Okay, thank you very much for that really important question. Different ways of answering it. I would say that the one image that I would think is very appropriate, if you imagine a galley, sorry, a ship full of slaves rowing, and you've got the the person cracking the whip is the factory owner in Bangladesh, who is driving his wage slaves to work as fast as they possibly can, 12, 14 hours a day, punishing them if they don't show up to work. But the person who is actually, who profits from this arrangement is sitting 10,000 miles away. So the real power is in the hands of the people at the top of the so-called value chain. So I think what's happened with just briefly during the period of so-called decolonization, when you had national liberation movements fighting to dismantle the colonial empires, what that led to was the emancipation of the elites in the poor countries. They were given a place for their snouts in the trough.
Okay.
Many of the elites in the poor countries, when you look at the actual sort of GDP per capita figures, it ignores the extreme inequalities within poor countries. And when you take into account, I'll just finish on this point, when you take into account that the elites of the poor countries, they, to a large extent, keep their wealth in rich countries and spend much of their time in the rich countries.
Okay.
In many ways, they have expatriated themselves. So the day of liberation of the working people is still to come. Interesting point, John. Dave?
Yeah, I don't think modern imperialism is much different from the historical examples I gave. You know, if you look at particularly India, the British Empire in India was created very much with the cooperation or the enrollment of some of the ruling classes of the host country, and that's what's happened in modern imperialism. What makes it easier as well for ruling classes to capture that control is two things really. One, very often we're dealing with primary products, so it's individual commodities like oil or something like that, which means that it's very centralized and easily controllable. You know, secondly, a lot of the capital that goes into those countries is almost like islands of capital. And And again, it's very easily controllable. And to back up that control of the local ruling class, very often it's on the back of export credits for weapons and instruments of control that comes from the developed world. You know, we've seen that particular in places like Nigeria, you know, with the hanging of Ken Saro-Wiwa. And we see increasingly around the world that even in countries like China, really, much of the capital that goes in there is American capital. So it can't be done without that cooperation.
Right. Okay, Dave, thank you. Leah, do you want a quick word or do you not?
No, I can pass on that one.
Okay, fine, that's fine. Next question, thanks Dave and John for that, is from Colin McCulloch. Neoliberal financialized capitalism is clearly a major driver of 21st century imperialism. However, you haven't commented on the role of illiberal countries which have oligarchic and state-directed capitalism, for example, Russia and especially China, which don't subscribe to the Washington consensus. I know the question goes on, but I'll stop there for the moment. So would any of you like to come in on the answering that question? The illiberal countries which have oligarchic and state-directed capitalism.
Well, I'll just comment briefly.
Go on, yeah, please do.
First of all, Russia is basically just a primary commodity exporter. It's very much an oil and raw materials. The really interesting and extremely complex one is China. I mean, I would say that China has thrown a lifeline to global capitalism on at least two occasions over the last 30, 40 years. First of all, when they threw open their doors to multinational corporations and offered up their extremely cheap and extremely hard-working workers to multinational corporations. That was one of the things that helped the capitalist countries in Europe and North America and Japan to escape from the crisis. Secondly, after the global financial crisis in 2007, 2008, China avoided being embroiled in the global economic crisis by a massive injection package, a huge stimulus package, which relative to the size of the economy is every bit as big as the one which the United States has carried out during the COVID. And their demand for raw materials and so on helped to contain the effect of the global financial crisis in 2007, 2008. Anyway, the last point is, it's very interesting that I would say that China still continues to be a net provider of wealth to the West. I mean, the Chinese workers continue to be exploited by Western multinational corporations. China is actually, it's interesting, China is lending large amounts of money to the United States to finance their deficit. Lending this money at in real terms, negative interest rates. So they're providing free money to the richest country on earth. At the same time, China is lending money to Africa and other countries at high rates of interest. So China is actually subsidizing its cheap loans to the rich countries by acting as a loan shark to poor countries. So there are many layers to this that need to be disentangled, but it is an important part of the picture.
Just in terms of this issue, Leah, are China and Russia part of the ISTS arrangement, these international corporation courts?
Russia has had to pay the highest ever ISDS case of, well, they haven't actually had to pay it yet, but they have the case against them. It's $50 billion. But they are a home state of some investors. It's initially ISDS was actually set up as a way for Western investors to be able to invest in former Soviet states without fear of having their investments expropriated. And from there, so I guess that's the sort of, it was the first site of that logic that, the justice systems in other countries that aren't in Europe and North America can be sort of trusted, and that logic is one that's been extended to basically the rest of the world, and now has come back to the north, because this, you know, this thing only became an issue for northern countries, because I should probably mention that the dial on ISDS is shifting a little bit. So European countries are changing their tune. I mean, they're kind of replacing it with things that are almost exactly the same, but calling them something different. But even then, there are some countries which are starting to withdraw from the ISDS regime and have left ICSID, and South Africa changed its position on ISDS following that case that I mentioned. But the UK is a staunch defender of the ISDS regime as it was, and it's pursuing its inclusion in trade deals.
Thanks, Leah. Dave, do you want to come in here?
Yeah, it's interesting what Leah was saying. It's interesting that all these trade deals, trade treaties, whatever you call them, they regard and they refer to nationalisation as expropriation, as though it was something being stolen, that it didn't belong to us in the first place. And I see Russia and China really as hybrid on the way to satisfying economic liberalism, but backed up by autocratic state. And I think your reference really to even the Western powers as liberal is something that is being challenged more and more. It's questionable whether our so-called liberal social ideas can exist alongside liberal capitalism. You know, we see people on the streets demonstrating this week against the police bill. We've seen people on the streets in France against demonstrating against the same. And as Leah said, many of the rules imposed by the WTO actually fall outside the remit of national governments. And, you know, Brexit was one of the reasons that motivated me to put this on tonight, or to help organise it, because, you know, I saw Brexit as quite a logical vote for many people in this country, because they came to realise that the labour market at the bottom was actually a very liberal place. And they didn't feel as though they were living in a liberal democracy anymore. You know, the workplace for many people, as we've heard, people working at Amazon, people on 0 hours contracts, it's not a cosy world. And if you read people like Karl Polanyi in the Great Transformation, he predicts that liberal market economics will transfer to fascism through the process of illiberal social imposition.
Okay. Thanks, Dave. By the way, everybody, the idea is to finish at about 9 o'clock, not much more than a minute or so behind that. So I'm now going to do Udit's question for the three of you to look at, which is, what are your processes in your individual scholarly activist practices to ensure that making the people affected the most central to your work and avoiding white saviorism? How do you factor and take responsibility for the white supremacist capitalist heteropatriarchy you embody? So that's a challenging question. What are your processes to put the people who are most affected in the middle of your research and activism? Who wants to start on that one? Leah.
Thanks. It's a really good and a really challenging question, and something that I feel like I think about quite a lot. I mean, I guess it's trying to, I try to take a cue from Southern activists and scholars. So on trade, sort of Third World Network, the South Centre are fantastic resources of Southern activists and scholars talking about how to challenge sort of free trade ideology. I guess for, you know, make choices about the kind of work that I do, no longer work in the global South, but yeah, work in the UK, and seek to foreground voices of War on Want, always these the foreground voices of our partners at the kind of forefront of struggles where and when we can, and provide support. But it's an ongoing struggle, and there's always more to learn, I would say, those things.
Thank you, Leah. Dave next, perhaps, then John.
Yeah, very, very challenging question for a gas fitter. I suppose the work that we do tries to recognise that the struggle of workers, whether in the global north or in the global south, are affected by, the class struggle, really. And you try and, I try and talk to people. Grunwick was, for many of us, was a formative experience in our political education. In our writings, we've wrote about the imperial typewriter struggle, as well as issues from the global south, because, like I say, the idea that classes only exist in the white global north is not correct. The class issue is a global issue that affects all genders, races, and we have to try and work with that, try and find people where we can. I suppose the best I can do really is on day-to-day empathy, the way we try and live our lives. I spent 3 or 4 years seconded to a trades union as a union learning project worker, some of the time working with migrant labour in food factories in East Anglia. And you develop a tremendous empathy with those people and they with us, really. And that's the best way we can do to try and build solidarity.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Dave. John?
Well, I mean, I welcome this question. I think, as Karl Marx said, the point is to change the world, not just to interpret it. And in my lifetime, the real revolutionary struggles have been in the global south. That's where the agency has been, and the responsibility, the duty of every human being, every progressive person, has been to give whatever support they can to the struggles where they actually are. And in the words of Che Guevara, to actually try and make the revolution in their own countries. The very first demonstration that I ever attended as a teenager was to oppose the military coup in Chile in 1973. And this revolutions in Central America, the struggle against apartheid, the struggle of the Vietnamese people, these really have made me and so many others of my generation the people that we are. So I feel that it's a valid question, but the struggle tomorrow, anybody in Sheffield should be in town at 12 o'clock outside the town hall. No country on earth, no people on earth have given more solidarity to others than Cuba. And right now, Cuba has its back to the wall. It's suffering from the effects of the coronavirus, the shutdown of the tourist trade, and also Donald Trump brought in 243 measures to tighten even further the blockade on that country. Joseph Biden has not relaxed a single one of them. It is shocking and really sobering that the United States, it has its knee on Cuba's neck, or thinks it has, and is going for the throat. And no country has given more solidarity to other people than Cuba. Cuba deserves our solidarity, and I hope you will join me outside the City Hall tomorrow at 12 o'clock, defending Cuba. And then Palestine Solidarity Campaign is also going to be there. So the way we actually, the way I'd answer your question is by urging everybody to join me and my friends and comrades in throwing ourselves and all our energy into the struggle to support people who are in the front line of the battle for human civilization.
Thanks, John. I do think the answer to the question is about the extent to which we can offer solidarity. And that seems measly compared to the experiences people are suffering across the world, but solidarity is what we can offer. And clearly, from my knowledge and even direct experience, things like Imperial typewriters, Mansfield hosiery, Grumwick actually throw a light on the internationalizer of capital and labor and exploitation. So solidarity seems to be the answer to that question from my point of view. Can I just say the last question I'm going to get put to people, and we'll come to an end, is from John Carlyle. Is the conflation of trade and imperialism really applicable? Does it not dilute the key point, that is labor as a commodity? England banned the import of cattle from Ireland in 1666, as the Scots cattle in the southwest were more attainable. This was just a trade decision. The same things happened with the textile industry in the 80s and India. Isn't imperialism, colonialism merely a power play in Rudyard Kipling's Great Game? So, Dave, would you like to respond to that and also make any closing comments you want to make?
I think it is a modern realization of imperialism. The point I made about labour being the source of all value, imperialism is about capturing value, and it is dressed up. It may be dressed up in nationalist clothing, or it's dressed up in the clothing of capital in disguise, really. I do believe that we need to manage economies. So I do think we do need stricter trade rules, and some of those trade rules do have to be applied. And it does eventually end up with the question about the ownership of the means of production, which we're a long way from asking that question. And I think that John's graph was illuminating that the two lines about parity in terms of spending power in countries came very close together in the 1970s, and has actually opened up as trade has become freer. Much of the trade we see today isn't actual trade, it's trade between companies, up to 50%, people think. But I think the imperial nature of it is the way it's enforced through the rules of the ruling nations, through the rules that we've expressed tonight.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dave. Leah, next. Any last comments you want to make as well as respond to that question?
I feel I'm not familiar with all of the references in this question, but interestingly, I had been going to mention the India textile case as actually a case in point of exactly this this aspect, because in my understanding, the UK had put really high tariffs on the import of Indian textiles into the UK and flooded India with cheap textiles. But I will read into it. In terms of like final comments,
yeah.
I'd just like to kind of say thank you. I found it a really interesting discussion. I've learned a lot, and I will share links if people want to stay updated with War on Want's actions and updates.
Thank you very much, Leah. And finally, John.
Thank you. Yeah, interesting question. I think that when we talk about trade in the modern world, we're talking about something different from trade 100 or 200 years ago, or even from trade 30 or 40 years ago. Dave pointed out that half of the goods that are traded are intermediate products. In other words, you have what we've seen in the last 30, 40 years is the globalization of production. No longer are the majority of items manufactured, all the processes, the stages in the process of manufacturing a commodity are no longer located within a country, but have been extended around the world. And that a lot of the trade that we see is merely the surface reflection of the globalization of the production process itself. And that is what is fundamentally new about the world that we see today. And that is why some estimates even go as far as 60% of trade is actually trade in intermediates, not in trade in final goods. And the thing that has been driving modern trade has been where labour power is cheapest and can be most disciplined. And that is why the trade agreements have been designed to facilitate the export or the outsourcing of production to low-wage countries, at the same time as guaranteeing the intellectual property rights and other forms of monopoly which guarantee the continued power of the apex of the value chains. So in other words, I think that you are right and you are wrong in your question. Trade in the past could not be conflated with imperialism, but today it certainly can.
Thank you, the last word. Dave, as author of this feast, within this festival, do you want to have another last word?
I think I would just encourage people to sometimes examine some of the statements around, like I say, linguistics is very, Chomsky is very good reading about linguistics, and they use linguistics to convince us that bad is good. The idea of free trade or anything with the word free in front of it, you should be very suspicious of. I do believe that we do need a more planned economy. And it was very interesting. I was at a lecture by Andy Haldane at the University of Sheffield, who's used to be Deputy Governor at the Bank of England, and he was extolling the virtues of the digital economy because we would be able to plan markets much better. We would know what people wanted before they even wanted it. And, there's a real danger that we will sleepwalk into some dystopian future. Just go back to one of the things about Adam Smith that people, the right wing, hold him up as a hero. Before he wrote The Wealth of Nations, he wrote a book called The Theory of Moral Sentiments that said that trade should be done face to face, because once you could look into the eyes of the other man, you knew that he wouldn't cheat you, and so you wouldn't cheat him. And world trade is so far away from that. And I think there is a lot more to be said for concentrating on home markets and supplying home economies than this rush to export economies and allowing the developing nations to grow themselves.
Okay, thank you very much, Dave. I want to say my thanks to Johnny and Sam for making sure all the IT worked well. I mean, I do personally feel committed to trying to make sure that in various struggles which are taking place within reach, within this country, understand the nature of imperialism as part of the way things have got the way they have. And for example, I live in Belper, which is in Derbyshire, some of you will know, and we're putting on an exhibition, an anti-racist exhibition in one of our parks. And what we're trying to do is to point out the contradictions of the so-called liberal struts owners of the textiles industry by pointing out they oppose slavery, but they actually use slavery. So there'll be a major exhibition which points out those contradictions and says, unless you understand the basis of the way the world economy has grown, you don't understand anything. So thank you, Sam, and thank you, Johnny. Johnny, you've come, so you're about to make a final remark, I guess.
It was just to put forward our thanks to, you've already thanked Sam for his support on the webinar in the chat this evening for all of our attendees. A big thank you to yourself for hosting. Obviously, a huge thank you to all of our panelists, Dave, John, and Leah. It's been a really fantastic and insightful and interesting event this evening. This year's festival actually started on Star Wars Day, May the 4th, and runs for 5 weeks. So if you go to festivaldebate.com, you can see the 4 weeks worth of brilliant events we've had so far on the Watch Again section. And you can check out the final week of the 2021 festival program there as well. On the website and all of our social media, if you are in a position to do so, you'll also find links to donate and support the festival if you can. And just also, obviously, a huge thank you goes to all of our audience this evening that gave up their Friday nights on potentially the first sunny day of May to join us to talk about this really fascinating subject. So thank you very much to all of you.
And as we say, hey, be careful out there. Well, are we still there? No, we're not.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks a lot, everybody.
Thanks, Dave, for initiating this.
Yeah, it was very interesting.
Thanks, Leah. Lovely to meet you. I hope we meet
What
again
next? What next?
virtually or